For 3 years, Clara Harrelson walked the dark road alone while the town of Oakhaven watched in silence. They knew powerful men were cruel. They knew the mine was crooked. They knew a widow was being pushed toward ruin. But fear kept every door closed until Clara's courage forced them to look at themselves. When the ground cracked, the barn burned, and the truth rose from the dirt, one woman's fight became a town's reckoning. Stay with this story, because sometimes justice begins when ordinary people finally stop looking away.
4 in the morning, Texas. The air was already thick, hot, still, and heavy, the kind of summer heat that never really went to sleep. It just waited in the dark. Clara Harrelson opened her eyes. She didn't stretch, didn't groan. 42 years old and a widow for 3 of them. She swung her legs out of bed and planted her bare feet on the floorboards. She didn't sigh either. Sighing was a luxury. It was for folks who had somebody around to ask what was wrong. Clara didn't. She lit a small tallow candle, pulled on her faded cotton dress, tied her boots. It was a routine. Simple. Quiet. She grabbed her wide-brimmed hat from the peg by the door, then picked up the 2 wooden buckets, iron hoops, thick rope handles. They were heavy before a single drop of water even touched them. She stepped out into the night. The public well was a half-mile down a dirt road, red dust and crickets. Just her, the moon, and the cicadas. She liked it that way. She had walked this road every single morning for 3 years, in the dark, alone. People town thought she was crazy or stubborn, maybe both. But this hour, this one, quiet hour before the roosters crowed and the sun started beating down, this belonged to her. Her boots crunched on the dry earth, a steady rhythm. Left, right, left, right. She rounded the bend. The well sat at the crossroads, a stone circled under the fading stars. Usually it was empty, just shadows and silence. Not today. Clara stopped, 5 yards away. Her grip tightened on the bucket handles. There was a man, a tall silhouette, standing right by the stone wall. Broad shoulders, a low-pulled hat. He was just standing there, looking out toward the horizon. He didn't hear her coming. Or maybe he did and just didn't care. Clara stood dead still. Her heart gave a hard thump. A woman alone in the dark learned to be careful, but she hadn't kept the ranch running by running away. She cleared her throat, just a sharp, short cough. The man turned. He didn't, just shifted his weight slowly. The moonlight caught his face for a second. Deep-set eyes. Lines dug hard around his mouth. He looked older than the dirt road. This was Silas Vance. The town had been whispering about him for a week. An ex-Pinkerton man. Hard as nails, they said. Silas looked at her. Then he'd look at the heavy buckets in her hands. He took a step back, yielding the well. He raised one hand and pointed at the iron crank, offering to pull the water up for her. A silent offer of help from a strong man to a tired widow. Clara didn't move toward the well. She looked him square in the eye, her voice cutting sharp and clear through the morning air. "I can pull my own weight, mister," Clara said. Silas lowered his hand, his expression unreadable in the dark. Clara held her ground, making sure he heard every single word. "Folks around here think a widow is a broken thing that needs fixing. But let me make something very clear to you. A woman's dignity doesn't come from being rescued. It comes from carrying her own water. The minute I let a man take my burden just out of pity, I trade my independence for a moment's rest. I don't need a savior, mister. I need to be treated as an equal who has a right to stand on this earth." She didn't wait for him to nod. She didn't wait for an apology. She just walked past him, set her buckets on the stone ledge, and grabbed the heavy iron crank herself. The chain rattled as the bucket dropped down into the dark water. Silas didn't say a word. He didn't step forward again. He just stood there, watching her pull the heavy water up, one hard turn at a time. She had walked here alone. She was drawing her water alone. But as the first light of dawn started to bleed red across the Texas sky, Clara knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow morning, she wouldn't be the only one standing at the well. Day 2. Same dark, same dust. Clara walked the road, left, right. The buckets knocked against her legs. The crickets were loud enough to rattle the teeth in her head. She kept her eyes on the horizon, waiting for the well to take shape in the gloom. He was there again, Silas Vance, standing exactly where he stood yesterday, like a fence post, like a shadow that the sun forgot to burn away. He saw her coming. He stepped back. He didn't offer to pull the crank. He didn't tip his hat. He just gave her the space she needed. Clara drew her water. The iron chain squealed. It was a harsh, ugly sound, but it was hers. She filled the buckets. She turned around. She walked back home. Not a single word passed between them. Day 3. Same thing. Day 4, the same. It became a strange kind of routine. 2 ghosts sharing the dark. By the afternoon of the 4th day, the heat was enough to melt lead. Clara hitched the wagon, drove into Oakhaven for supplies. The town was small. People talked. They talked a lot when the rain didn't come. She walked into the mercantile. Smelled like coffee beans and old leather. A few men were leaning on the counter, spitting tobacco into a brass spittoon. They got quiet when she walked in, but they hadn't been quiet before. She caught the tail end of it. Pinkerton man, one of them had said. Cold blood in his veins. Clara bought her flour, bought her salt. Paid with coins she had counted 3 times that morning. She didn't ask about Silas Vance. She didn't need to. The town was terrified of him. They said he had a badge once. Said he hung men for a living. Now he was back, living in that run-down shack near the well, just staring at the dirt. Clara drove the wagon home. That evening, the air finally cooled. A little breeze kicked up off the dry creek bed. Clara sat on the front porch, shelling peas into a tin bowl. The screen door banged. Eleanor stepped out, 16 years old. Hair like her daddy S, eyes like her mama S. Smart girl. Read every book the schoolhouse had. Eleanor sat on the top step. She wrapped her arms around her knees. She watched Clara shell the peas for a long time. People are talking, Mama, Eleanor said. People always talk, El, Clara said. Pop. A pea hit the tin. They say you go out to the well when it's pitch black. Say that man is out there. That Pinkerton. His name is Sila, Clara said. Pop. Why do you do it? Eleanor asked. Her voice hitched a little. Why do you go out there alone? You could ask Mr. Miller to haul water for us. You could ask any of the men in town. They'd do it. You wouldn't have to carry those buckets. Clara stopped. She let her hands rest in her lap. She looked at her daughter. Listen to me, Eleanor, Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but it was hard as flint. And hear me well, because this is something the books won't teach you. Eleanor looked up. When a man asks another man for help, it's called being neighborly, Clara said. When a woman alone asks a man for help, the world writes it down different. They don't call it kindness. They call it a debt. They look at a widow and they see weakness. They see someone who can't stand on her own 2 feet. Clara picked up another pod, snapped it open. I don't ask the men in town to haul my water because I won't owe them my freedom. Every drop of water I pull myself is proof that I have a right to be here. A woman's independence isn't given to her. It is taken. It is carried. If I let them do my heavy lifting, they'll start thinking they have a say in how I run this ranch. I am teaching you right now, Eleanor. You never trade your dignity for an easy morning. Eleanor nodded slowly. She understood. Next morning, 4 o'clock. Clara walked to the well. Silas was there. He stepped back, just like always. Clara set her buckets down, but she didn't grab the crank. She turned and looked at him. Really looked at him. "You don't sleep," Clara said. Her voice broke the morning quiet. Silas looked at her. He took off his hat, ran a hand through his graying hair. "I sleep fine, Mrs. Harrelson," Silas said. His voice was gravel, deep and rough. "Then why are you out here every single day?" Clara crossed her arms. "You don't fetch water, you just stand there." Silas didn't look away. He didn't shuffle his feet. "I stand here because this road is dark," Silas said, "and it's a half-mile from your house. It ain't safe for a woman to walk alone in the dark with desperate men drifting through this county." Clara stiffened. "I told you the first day. I don't need a savior." "I know you don't," Silas said flatly, "and I'm not trying to be one. Let me be clear with you, ma'am. I stand out here to protect your right to walk this road safely. But I keep my mouth shut and my hands to myself because I respect your pride. A man can offer protection without making a woman feel weak. I am out here guarding the road, not guarding you. You carry your water. You fight your fight. I'm just making sure nobody ambushes you in the dark while you do it." Clara stared at him. She let the words sink in. He wasn't pitying her. He was giving her a safe perimeter so she could do the hard work herself. "That's a fine line you're walking, Mr. Vance," Clara said. "It's the only line worth walking," Silas replied. He put his hat back on. Clara turned, grabbed the crank, pulled her water. When she walked home, the buckets felt heavy, but the road felt a little less lonely. The drought held on. It choked the life out of Oak Haven. The dirt turned to powder. The wind blew hot. Clara's hands were paying the price. The rope handles of the wooden buckets dug in deep. Blisters broke. Calluses cracked. Every pull on that iron crank at the well felt like dragging a saw blade across her palms. She didn't stop. She couldn't. The corn was dying. The horses needed water. Tuesday morning, still dark. Clara walked to the well. Her hands were wrapped in old rags. It didn't help much. She breathed in the dry air, tasted dust. Silas was there, standing his post. He stepped back. Clara walked up to the stone ledge. She went to set her buckets down. She stopped. Sitting right on the edge of the stone, right where she always put her buckets, was a pair of gloves. Soft buckskin. Men's gloves, but small, well-worn, supple. Clara looked at the gloves. Then she looked at Silas. He was staring at the horizon, pretending he didn't notice. Clara picked them up. They were soft. They would save her hands. But her flied up hot and fast in her chest. She walked over to him. She held the gloves out. "Take them back," Clara said. Silas turned his head, looked at the gloves, looked at her. "They're just lying there," Silas said. "Don't play dumb with me, Mr. Vance," Clara said. "I told you I don't take charity. I don't take pity." Silas didn't reach for the gloves. He looked her right in the eye. "I need you to listen to me, Clara," Silas said. It was the first time he used her given name. It sounded heavy coming from him. "I didn't hand those to you. I left them on the rock because I know if I handed them to you, it would be an act of pity. And pity is an insult to a strong person." He stepped closer, just a half step. "I am stating this plainly," Silas continued. "I respect your hard work. I see your hands bleeding. Acknowledging someone's pain is not the same as pitying them. Empathy is not an insult. You are strong enough to carry the water. But there is no virtue in suffering just for the sake of suffering. Put the gloves on. Protect your hands so you can keep fighting. Taking a tool that helps you survive doesn't make you weak. It makes you smart." Clara stood there, her heart hammered. He hadn't told her to stop working. He hadn't offered to do it for her. He just offered her a better way to fight. She pulled her hand back. She looked at the buckskin. "All right," Clara said softly. She slipped the gloves on. They fit well enough. She went to the well, grabbed the crank. It still took effort, but the sharp, biting pain was gone. "Thank you," she said to the dark. "You're welcome," Silas said. That afternoon, the real trouble arrived. Clara was out by the barn, fixing a broken hinge on the gate. The sound of wheels crunching on gravel made her look up. A black buggy rolled into the yard. Fancy springs. Two matched bay horses. It kicked up a cloud of dust that settled right on Clara's porch. Josiah Sterling. He owned the bank in town. He owned half the land around it. He was a man who wore wool suits in the dead of summer, just to prove he could afford to sweat. Sterling climbed down from the buggy, adjusted his vest. He looked around the ranch. He wrinkled his nose, like he smelled something dead. "Mrs. Harrelson," Sterling said. He tipped his hat, but there was no respect in it. "Mr. Sterling," Clara said. She didn't drop her hammer. "I'll get right to it," Sterling said. He walked over to the fence, leaned against it. "This drought is killing the county. The ground is baked solid. Your late husband was a hard worker, Lord rest his soul. But Thomas is gone. And let's speak frankly. A woman can't manage this dirt. Not alone." Clara tightened her grip on the hammer. She stayed quiet. Let him dig his hole. "You're behind on your taxes." Sterling lied smoothly. "You've got no hands to work the fields. It's a sad sight, but I am a generous man. I'm willing to buy this parcel off you, pay off your debts, give you enough to move back east, somewhere soft, where a lady belongs." He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, a deed of sale. Clara looked at the paper. Then she looked at Sterling. She walked up to the fence. She stopped 2 feet from him. "Put that paper away, Josiah," Clara said. Her voice didn't shake. It was cold. Sterling frowned. "Now, Clara, don't be foolish. This is a man's game, the law says." "I don't care what your law says," Clara interrupted. She spoke loud. She spoke clear. She wanted him to hear every single syllable. "You stand there and tell me a woman can't manage this dirt," Clara said. "You think holding a piece of paper makes you a man? You think a suit makes you a master. But let me educate you on the reality of the world, Mr. Sterling." She pointed the hammer at the dry earth. "The dirt down there doesn't know the difference between a man's sweat and a woman's sweat. The sun doesn't shine less on my fields just because I wear a skirt. Hard work makes the land yield, not gender, not a suit, not a bank account." Sterling bristled. His face went red. "Listen here, widow. No, you listen." Clara cut him off sharp. "A woman's right to own her labor, to own the dirt she bleeds on, is exactly the same as yours. The law in this county might turn a blind eye to women. The law might say, you're better than me. But true justice doesn't care about what's between my ears or under my dress. True justice values grit. And I have more grit in my bleeding hands than you have in your entire bank." She stepped right up to the fence. "I am not selling. I am not leaving. You want my land? You'll have to bury me under it. Now get off my property before I find a use for this hammer that ain't fixing a gate." Sterling stared at her. His mouth worked, but no words came out. He saw the fire in her eyes. He saw the buckskin gloves on her hands. He snatched the paper back, stuffed it in his pocket. "You'll regret this, Clara," Sterling hissed. "Pride goes before a fall." "I ain't falling," Clara said, "and I won't break." Sterling climbed back into his buggy. He whipped the horses hard. The buggy tore out of the yard, leaving a thick cloud of dust behind. Clara stood there. She watched the dust settle. She looked down at her hands. The soft buckskin gloves were covered in dirt. She turned around, walked back to the barn, and went back to work. The water in the well was dropping. Clara could feel it in the chain. It took longer for the bucket to hit the surface. The splash sounded hollow. The drought was drinking the earth dry from the inside out. It was a Tuesday, 4 in the morning. The stars were sharp and cold, even though the air was thick with heat. Silas was there. He stood by the stone wall. He watched the horizon. He always watched the horizon, like he was expecting something terrible to ride out of the dark. Clara pulled the crank, hand over hand. The buckskin gloves squeaked against the iron. "You look tired, Mr. Vance," Clara said. She didn't stop cranking. She just threw the words out into the dark. Silas shifted his weight. His boots scraped the dirt. He pulled a tobacco pouch from his vest, rolled a cigarette. He didn't light it, just held it between his fingers. "Tired is for folks who work a plow, Clara," Silas said. "I'm just haunted. There's a difference." Clara locked the crank. She lifted the heavy, dripping bucket, set it on the stone. She leaned against the damp rock and looked at him, really looked at him. The lines on his face were carved deep. He looked like a man who had seen the bottom of the world. "Who is it?" Clara asked. Silas looked at his unlit cigarette. He rolled it between his thumb and forefinger. "His name was Jacob Miller," Silas said. His voice was quiet. The crickets seemed to stop chirping, just to listen. "3 years ago, up near Abilene, a bank manager got shot dead in an alley. They brought me in to find the man who did it. I was a Pinkerton, a best in the business," they said. "I found a trail. It led to Jacob." Silas struck a match on his thumbnail. The flare lit up his eyes. They were dead and gray. He lit the smoke, blew a thin stream into the night. "He swore he didn't do it," Silas continued. "But I found the stolen money under his floorboards. I found the gun in his barn. I put the irons on him myself. I stood there while the judge sentenced him. I stood there while they put the rope around his neck." Clara didn't move. She just listened. "A month later," Silas said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "we caught a rustler down in Bexar County. Man was dying of a gut shot, wanted to clear his conscience. He confessed to the Abilene bank job, told us exactly how he planted the money under Jacob's floor, exactly how he hid the gun." Silas took another drag. The cherry of the cigarette burned bright red. "I hung an innocent man, Clara. I used my badge, I used my brains, and I killed a man who only ever tried to feed his family." He dropped the cigarette, crushed it under his boot. He looked up at her. "I learned a hard lesson that day," Silas said. He stepped closer. He wanted her to hear this. He needed her to hear it. "I want to state this plainly, Clara. The law is not the same thing as justice. The law is often just a tool for the strong to crush the weak. It is a set of rules written by rich men to protect what they own. It doesn't care about truth. It only cares about order. And when you enforce the law without a conscience, you are nothing but a hired gun for the devil." Clara looked at the dark water in her bucket. She thought about her husband. She thought about the mining company. She lifted her head. Her eyes met his. "If the law is a tool for the strong," Clara said, her voice steady and clear, "then we have a moral obligation to make justice a weapon for the weak. You listen to me, Silas Vance. Guilt is a heavy thing to carry, but wallowing in it doesn't do Jacob Miller any good. You cannot bring the dead back. But you can use that badge, and you can use your brains to stand between the queen corrupt and the innocent." Westward isn't measured by the mistakes he made in the dark. It is measured by what he chooses to do when the sun comes up. Silas stared at her. The wind kicked up, rustling the dry grass. "You speak hard truths, Clara," he said softly. "I only know the hard ones," she replied. She picked up her buckets. She walked home. That afternoon, the heat broke for just an hour. The sky clouded over. No rain, just heavy gray clouds that trapped the heat like a wool blanket. Clara was in the house. Eleanor was at the schoolhouse in town. Clara needed an old tarp to cover the feet in the barn. She went to the back room, the room she hadn't really cleaned out since Thomas died. There was a heavy oak trunk at the foot of the bed. Thomas's trunk. Clara knelt on the dusty floorboards. She popped the brass latches. They groaned. She lifted the heavy lid. It smelled like cedar and him. His winter coat was neatly folded on top. His good boots. A few books. Clara dug past them. She found the canvas tarp at the bottom. She pulled it out. As she did, something fell out of the folds. A small black leather notebook, bound with a thin leather strap. Clara frowned. Thomas had been a shift boss down in the Hendricks mine. He kept tallies of ore carts, but he always turned his ledgers in to the company office. She sat back on her heels. She untied the strap. She opened the book. The handwriting was Thomas S. Sharp, slanted, hurried. She flipped past pages of numbers, tonnage, hours worked. But near the back, the numbers stopped. It turned into journal entries. August 12th. Found the new cut on level 4. The timber is rotted. Pine, not oak. They are billing the investors for oak and pocketing the difference. The roof is going to come down. Clara S. breath hitched. She turned the page. August 18th. I saw the boys today. 3 of them couldn't be older than 10. Working the deep seam where the gas builds up. The foreman threatened to fire me if I spoke up. Child labor is cheap. Dead children are cheaper. I can't stay quiet anymore. Clara's hands began to shake. She turned one more page, the last entry, dated 2 days before Thomas died. September 3rd. I took the shipping manifests. I took the purchase orders for the timber. I have the proof. I am taking the train to Austin on Monday to see the state inspector. I know they are watching me. If something happens, the papers are buried where they won't find them. The books slipped from Clara's hands. It hit the floor with a soft thud. Thomas didn't die in an accident. He didn't slip. He didn't make a mistake. The roof of level 4 didn't just collapse on him by chance. They knew he was going to Austin. They dropped a mountain on her husband to keep him quiet. Clara sat on the floor of the bedroom. The silence of the house pressed in on her. She didn't cry. The tears wouldn't come. Instead, a cold, hard knot formed in the center of her chest. It was rage, pure, white-hot, and quiet. Thomas was murdered. The company killed him, and they had paid her $20 in compensation for her tragic loss. Clara picked up the black notebook. She gripped it tight. The leather creaked in her fist. The law hadn't protected Thomas. The law had protected the mine. She remembered what she told Silas at the well. Makes justice a weapon for the weak. Clara stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at her dry, cracked fields. They wanted to take her husband. Now they wanted to take her land. They had made a terrible mistake. They had left her alive. Sheriff Miller rode into the yard just before noon. He rode a tired, gray gelding. He didn't look happy. He swung down from the saddle, dusted off his trousers. He took his hat off before he even stepped onto the porch. Clara was waiting for him. She stood by the porch rail. The black notebook was safely hidden under the floorboards in the kitchen. "Morning, Clara," Sheriff Miller said. He looked at his boots. "What brings the law out to my dirt?" "Sheriff?" Clara asked. She kept her voice even. Miller sighed, reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a heavy manila envelope. It had the county seal stamped in red wax on the back. "I hate doing this," Miller said. "I truly do. Thomas was a good man, and you've worked this place hard, but the county kept me out." He held out the envelope. Clara didn't reach for it. "What is it?" "It's a notice of foreclosure, Clara, from the bank. Josiah Sterling signed it this morning." Miller shifted uncomfortably. "It says you owe 3 years of back taxes." with interest. Total comes to $400. You have 30 days to pay it, or the bank takes the deed to the ranch. Clara stared at the envelope. I paid my taxes, Clara said. Every penny. I have the receipts. I told Sterling that, Miller said. He said your receipts don't match the county ledger. He says there was a miscalculation. And the law is the law. The ledger is the official record. Clara finally took the envelope. It felt heavy, like a brick. Sterling wants this land, Clara said quietly. He came here 2 days ago. Tried to buy me out. I told him no. Now he's using a rigged ledger to steal it. I can't prove that, Clara, Miller said apologetically. I just served the papers. I'm sorry. He put his hat back on, climbed onto his horse, rode away. Clara stood on the porch. She looked at the red wax seal. A shadow fell across the steps. Silas Vance walked out from the side of the barn. He had been fixing a wagon wheel. His hands were covered in grease. He had heard the whole thing. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer empty sympathies. He looked at the envelope in her hand. Sterling, Silas said. Yes, Clara said. $400 is a fortune, Silas said. You don't have it. No, Clara said. I don't. Silas wiped his hands on an old rag. He threw the rag over a fence post. Saddle my horse, Silas said. Clara frowned. Where are you going? I'm going to town, Silas said. I'm going to the county clerk's office. Silas, you can't just go beat a man until he changes a ledger, Clara said sharply. That's not how we do this. I won't have you hanging for my dirt. Silas stopped. He turned around. He looked deeply offended. I am a Pinkerton, Clara, Silas said. His voice was dead calm. I don't need my fists to ruin a man. I need paper. He went to the barn. He saddled his own horse. He rode out toward Oakhaven. The county clerk's office was in the back of the courthouse. It was a dusty room filled with tall wooden filing cabinets. It smelled like decaying paper and stale ink. The clerk was a nervous little man named Higgins. He wore spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. Silas walked in. He didn't knock. He just stood in the doorway. He looked at Higgins. Can I help you, Mr. Vance? Higgins stammered. I need the land deeds for the Harrelson property, Silas said, and I need the corporate filings for the Hendricks Mining Company going back 5 years. Higgins swallowed hard. Those are public record, yes, but it takes time to pull them. Perhaps tomorrow. Silas took 2 steps forward. He placed his large, scarred hands flat on the wooden counter. He leaned in. I'll wait, Silas said. It took Higgins 10 minutes. He brought a stack of ledgers and heavy parchment folders to the counter. Silas didn't say thank you. He just opened the first book. Silas knew how to read the paper trail. It was his greatest weapon. Crooks always lied. Bullets always missed. But ink never changed its mind. He spent 3 hours in that stuffy room. He traced the tax payments. Clara was right. Her payments were logged, but an amendment had been added in red ink just 3 days ago, forging a tax debt. Signed by Josiah Sterling, acting on behalf of the county bank. But Silas didn't stop there. He opened the corporate filings for Hendricks Mining. He read through the board of directors, the majority shareholders. It was a web of shell companies, fake names, dummy corporations based out of Chicago. Silas kept pulling the thread. He cross-referenced the dummy corporations with the bank's investment ledgers. There it was, buried on page 42 of a secondary ledger. Just Sterling's owned 40% of Hendricks Mining. He was the shadow partner. He was the man who profited from the cheap timber. He was the man who profited from the child labor. And, Silas realized as he looked at the geological survey attached to the deed, Sterling knew exactly what sat under Clara's ranch. The largest untouched underground aquifer in the county. With the drought, water was worth more than gold. Sterling ordered Thomas Harrelson killed to protect the mine. Now he was stealing the ranch to get the water. Silas carefully folded the pages. He paid Higgins a silver dollar for official copies. He walked out of the courthouse. The sun was going down. He rode back to the ranch. Clara was sitting at the kitchen table. The kerosene lamp was lit. Eleanor was asleep in the back room. Silas walked in. He didn't knock. He dropped a thick stack of papers on the table, right next to Clara's coffee cup. Clara looked at the papers. Then she looked at him. "What is this?" Clara asked. "This is the rope that Josiah Sterling is going to hang himself with," Silas said. He sat down across from her. He was tired, but his eyes were burning. He explained it to her. All of it. The forged taxes, the shadow partnership, the aquifer, the motive for Thomas's murder. Clara listened. Her face didn't change. She just stared at the papers. "He killed my husband," she whispered, "and he came to my house. He stood in my yard." "He did," Silas said. Clara reached out. She touched the papers. "You didn't fix it for me," Clara said softly. She looked up at Silas. "No," Silas said. "I didn't. I could have taken these papers to the judge myself. I could have gone to Sterling's house with a pistol and ended it. But I didn't." "Why?" Clara asked. Silas leaned forward. He rested his arms on the table. "Because I want to make an educational point here, Clara," Silas stated clearly, his voice rumbling in the quiet kitchen. "I am stating this explicitly. True equality means I do not fight your battles for you. That would rob you of your agency. True respect means I arm you with the truth, and I step back so you can strike the blow yourself. I am not your savior. I am your partner in this fight. The right to confront your oppressor belongs to you, and no man has the right to take that victory from you." Clara sat up straighter. The exhaustion seemed to drain out of her. The fire returned to her eyes. She placed her flat on the stack of papers. "You are a good man, Silas Vance," Clara said clearly. "I will say this plainly so there is no misunderstanding between us. A woman's fight is her own. But knowing there is someone willing to pass her the ammunition without asking for a medal, that is the highest form of respect. I will not be a victim of Josiah Sterling. I will be his ruin, and I will do it in the broad daylight." She stood up. She took the papers. She took Thomas's black notebook from the counter. She put them all in a canvas bag. "Get some sleep, Mr. Vance," Clara said. "What are you going to do?" Silas asked. "Tomorrow," Clara said, her voice hard as steel, "I am going to start digging a well, and then I am going to bury a banker." The ground was like iron. Clara stood in the yard behind the house. The sun wasn't even up yet, but the heat was already rising from the dirt. It smelled like baked clay. She held a heavy pickaxe in her gloved hands. She raised it high, brought it down hard. Thwack! The iron tip bit into the earth as it barely chipped the surface. A puff of red dust drifted up. Clara wiped her brow. She raised the axe again. Thwack! This was going to take a long time. Digging a well by yourself in a Texas drought was a fool's errand. But Clara was done being a victim. She was going to find water on her own land. She was going to cut Josiah Sterling's throat with the truth, and she was going to do it standing on her own 2 feet. She raised the axe a third time. "Hold up there, Clara." The voice came from the front gate. Clara stopped. She lowered the axe. She turned around. Through the early morning haze, a wagon rolled up to the fence. Then another. First to step down was Murphy, the town blacksmith. Man built like a brick wall, wearing leather suspenders and carrying a long-handled shovel. Behind him came 3 other men from town, old miners, men with bad lungs and crooked backs. Then came Hetty Walsh, the former mayor's widow. She was carrying a large tin coffee pot and a basket of biscuits. Clara stared. She gripped the handle of the pickaxe. Murphy walked up to the gate, latched it. He stepped into the yard. The other men followed. They didn't look at Clara with pity. They looked at the ground. They looked ashamed. Hetty walked right up to Clara. The older woman set the basket down on an upturned barrel. She looked Clara dead in the eye. "Put the axe down, Clara," Hetty said. "This is my dirt, Hetty," Clara said. Her voice was guarded. "I didn't ask for a handout, and we ain't giving you one," Hetty shot back. She stood tall. She didn't flinch. "I want to state this clearly, Clara, for you, and for my own conscience. We stayed quiet when Thomas died. The whole town did. We knew Hendricks Mining was crooked. We knew Sterling was bleeding folks dry. But we kept our mouths shut because it was safe, because we were cowards." Hetty pointed a finger at the men behind her. "I am teaching these men a lesson today, and I am saying it out loud," Hetty continued, her voice ringing clear in the morning air. "When a community turns a blind eye to injustice just because it's easier, the whole town rots from the inside out. Silence isn't neutrality. Silence is complicity. True community means sharing the danger, not just the water. We failed Thomas. We failed you. We are here today because standing up to tyranny is a collective duty, not a solitary burden. We are going to dig this well because it's the right thing to do." Clara looked at Hetty. Then she looked at the blacksmith. Murphy just nodded. He spat in his hands, grabbed his shovel. Clara felt a tight knot in her chest loosen. Just a fraction. Over by the barn, leaning against the weathered wood, stood Silas. He had his arms crossed. He had watched the whole thing. He didn't come forward to take charge. He didn't organize the men. He just watched the town finally do what it should have done 3 years ago. Clara caught his eye. Silas gave a slow single nod. It wasn't his victory, it was hers. She had inspired it. "All right," Clara said. She dropped the pickaxe. "Start digging." While the shovels broke the earth in Oakhaven, Silas Vance was riding hard. He had a lead. A whisper from a drifter about an old miner living out near San Angelo. A man who drank too much and slept too little. A man named Amos Miller. Silas knew the name. He remembered the face. He needed Amos. The papers in Thomas's lockbox were damning, but a piece of paper couldn't take the witness stand. A piece of paper couldn't look a judge in the eye. To hang Sterling in a courtroom, Silas needed the man who saw the timber being cut, the man who saw the supports being rigged. The ride took 2 days. The cabin was a rotting shack at the end of a box canyon. It looked like a strong wind would knock it over. Empty whiskey bottles littered the front porch. Silas tied his horse to a dead scrub oak. He unbuckled the leather strap over his holster, just in case. He walked up the creaking steps. He didn't knock. He kicked the door open. It was dark inside. Smelled like sweat and sour mash. A man was sitting at a wobbly wooden table. He had a shotgun across his lap, but his hands were shaking too hard to lift it. Amos Miller looked up. His eyes were bloodshot. His face was covered in a ragged gray beard. "I ain't got money," Amos rasped. "I don't want your money, Amos," Silas said. He stepped into the room. He didn't draw his gun in. He just stood there, filling the doorway. Amos squinted. He leaned forward. Recognition dawned in his cloudy eyes. He sucked in a harsh breath. "Pinkerton," Amos whispered. "Not anymore," Silas said. Amos looked at the shotgun. Then he looked at Silas. He let go of the gun. He buried his face in his dirty hands. "They sent you," Amos sobbed. "Sterling sent you to finish it." "Sterling didn't send me," Silas said. He walked over to the table. He pulled out a chair. It groaned under his weight. He sat down right across from the broken old man. "I came from Oakhaven," Silas said. I came from Clara Harrelson's ranch. Amos flinched at the name, like he'd been struck with a whip. Thomas, Amos muttered, I saw it. God help me, I saw the beams, I saw them rig the roof. I told us to keep his mouth shut. I told him, but he wouldn't. Amos reached for a bottle on the table. It was empty. He knocked it over. I ran, Amos cried. I took my pay and I ran. I let them crush a good man. I'm a coward, Vance. Just put a bullet in me. Do me the favor. Silas didn't move. He sat perfectly still. He let the silence stretch out until the shack felt to him. I will not shoot you, Amos, Silas said. His voice was a low, steady rumble. I am going to speak plainly to you because you need to hear this. I want to educate you on the reality of guilt. Amos looked up through his fingers. Running doesn't wash the blood off, Silas said explicitly. I know this for a fact. You can drink until you go blind, and you can hide in a canyon until you die. But a man's conscience is the only court that never adjourns. You owe a debt, not just to the dead, but to the living. Clara Harrelson is fighting for her land. She is fighting the very men who killed your friend. Hiding from your past is a selfish luxury you can no longer afford. Silas leaned closer. His gray eyes bored into the old miner. A man's worth isn't decided by his worst moment of cowardice, Silas stated. It is decided by what he does when he is given a second chance to do the right thing. True redemption requires action. You have to face the light. You have to stand in a courtroom and tell the truth. Taking responsibility is the only way a man buys back his soul. Now, get your boots on. We're riding back to Oakhaven. Amos stared at him. He was trembling, but the words had hit their mark. Cut through the whiskey haze. He slowly pushed his chair back. He stood up. He'll kill me, Amos whispered. Sterling will have me killed. He'll try, Silas said. He stood up. But he has to get through me first. Back at the Harrelson ranch, the sun was dropping low. The hole in the yard was 8 feet deep and wide. 6 men had been taking turns all day, swinging pickaxes, shoveling the loose dirt into buckets, hoisting it up with a rope and pulley. They were exhausted, covered in red clay, blisters on top of blisters. Clara stood at the edge of the pit. She handed down a tin cup of water to Murphy. The big blacksmith drank it in one gulp. He wiped his mouth with the back of his dirty arm. Ground's getting softer. Clara, Murphy called up. His voice echoed slightly in the hole. Smells damp. We might hit the water table by tomorrow. You've all done enough for today, Clara said. Come on up. Eat some supper. Just let me clear this last pile, Murphy said. Turned back to the earth. He raised his pickaxe. He swung it down into a hard patch near the edge of the pit. Clang. It wasn't the dull thud of dirt. It wasn't the sharp crack of rock. It was a sharp, hollow metallic ring. The sound stopped everyone in their tracks. Hetty dropped a spoon. The miners turned around. Murphy frowned. He dropped to his knees in the dirt. He used his gloved hands to brush the loose soil away. What is it? Clara called down. Her heart gave a sudden, strange kick. Ain't a rock, Murphy muttered. He grabbed a hand trowel. He dug furiously around the edges of whatever he had struck. The dark shape in the dirt began to reveal itself. It was square. It was rusted. It had heavy brass hinges. It's a box, Murphy said. He looked up at Clara. His eyes were wide. Somebody buried an iron lockbox under your yard. Clara stopped breathing. The papers are buried where they won't find them. Thomas's final journal entry echoed in her head. She had thought he meant out in the fields. She had thought they were lost forever. But he hadn't buried them far away. He had buried them right behind the house, right where he knew she would eventually have to dig if the old well ever went dry. He trusted her to find it. Bring it up, Clara said. Her voice shook, just a little. Bring it up right now. Murphy hooked the rope around the heavy iron handles. The men on the surface hauled it up. The pulley squealed. The box breached the edge of the pit and landed on the grass with a heavy thud. It was covered in 3 years of dirt. The iron was pitted with rust. The heavy brass padlock on the front was locked tight. The townsfolk gathered around it. They formed a tight circle. Nobody spoke. Clara walked up to the box. She dropped to her knees. She didn't care about the dirt on her dress. She pulled off her buckskin gloves. She touched the rust-dusted iron. "Stand back," Murphy said. He stepped forward with a heavy iron crowbar. Clara moved aside. Murphy wedged the flat end of the crowbar under the brass padlock. He grunted. He threw his massive weight against the bar. With a loud crack, the rusted lock gave way. It snapped and fell into the dirt. Murphy stepped back. He looked at Clara. He gestured to the lid. It was her box. It was her right. Clara reached out. Her bare fingers curled under the heavy iron lip. She pulled upward. The hinges shrieked, protesting the movement after 3 years in the dark. The lid fell back. Inside, wrapped in heavy, oiled canvas to protect it from the damp, was a thick stack of papers. Clara reached in. She pulled the canvas bundle out. She unrolled it, right there on the grass. The townsfolk leaned in closer. Clara's eyes scanned the top document. It was a contract between Hendricks Mining and a timber supplier. Written across the bottom, approving the purchase of cheap, substandard pine instead of oak, was a signature. Josiah Sterling. She moved that paper aside. Beneath it was an internal ledger. It listed the names of the miners. Next to 3 names, the ages were listed, 8, 9, 10. Paid half wages, working the deep seam. Approved by a shadow director, Josiah Sterling. And beneath that, the most damning piece of all, a letter from the state inspector in Austin, acknowledging a meeting requested by Thomas Harrelson, dated for the Monday after Thomas was killed. It was the complete puzzle. Every missing piece. Hetty Walsh covered her mouth with her hand. Murphy let out a long, slow breath. They had all known Sterling was crooked, but knowing a man is a thief is one thing. Looking at the ink that ordered a good man's murder is another. "Good Lord," one of the old miners whispered. "He really did it. Sterling killed him." Clara didn't cry. She didn't scream. She carefully gathered the papers. She wrapped them back in the oiled canvas. She held the bundle to her chest. She stood up. She looked at the faces of her neighbors, the people who had been afraid. "You see this?" Clara asked them. Her voice was steady. It was the voice of a woman who was done being afraid. "We see it, Clara," Murphy said quietly. "Good," Clara said, "because when we go to court, I am going to need witnesses who saw this come out of the ground." "Sterling tried to bury my husband. Then he tried to bury me. But he made a mistake." Clara looked out toward the dirt road, toward the horizon. "He forgot that dirt is exactly what we work with." The smoke woke her first. It was thick, bitter. It smelled like burning pine and coal oil. Clarissa sat up in bed, her chest seized. The room was pitch black, but the window frame was glowing. A harsh, angry orange light danced across the glass. She didn't scream. She threw the covers off. Her bare feet hit the floorboards. "Eleanor," Clara shouted. She ran to the next room. Eleanor was already sitting up, coughing, rubbing her eyes. Clara grabbed the girl's arm, pulled her out of bed. "Get your boots on, go to the front yard, stay away from the back." "Go!" Clara didn't wait to see her daughter run. She turned and ran through the kitchen. She hit the back door so hard the hinges groaned. She burst out into the night air. The barn was on fire. The flames were crawling up the dry, weathered siding, licking at the hayloft doors. The heat hit Clara like a physical blow. It was a wall of fire, pushing against the heavy summer air. Inside the barn, the horses were screaming. It was a terrible, high-pitched sound, the sound of blind panic. Clara ran toward the flames. She didn't think about the heat. She didn't think about her nightgown catching embers. She just thought about the animals. A shadow moved fast across the yard. It was Silas. He had been sleeping in the lean-to behind the house. He didn't have his hat. He didn't have his boots laced. He held a heavy woolen blanket in his hands. He plunged it into the rain barrel beside the porch, soaking it through. The horses! Clara yelled over the roar of the fire. "Stay back," Silas roared back. He threw the soaking heavy blanket over his head and shoulders. He ran straight into the burning barn. Clara didn't stay back. She ran to the water trough. She grabbed the 2 wooden buckets she used every morning. She dunked them. The water was low. She hauled them out, heavy and sloshing. She ran toward the barn walls and threw the water at the base of the fire. It hissed. A cloud of white steam blew back in her face. It did almost nothing. Men were shouting. Murphy, the blacksmith, came tearing around the side of the house. Hetty Walsh's 2 nephews were right behind him. The men who had been digging the well had set up bedrolls in the front yard to start early the next morning. "Dirt!" Murphy bellowed. "Water ain't enough. Shovel the dirt." The men grabbed the shovels they had used all day. They ran to the mounds of red clay they had excavated from the well pit. They scooped heavy loads of dirt and hurled it at the flames, smothering the fire, choking it out. Inside the barn, timber cracked. A loud, sharp sound like a cannon shot. Clara froze. She dropped her buckets. "Silas!" she screamed. Through the thick black smoke pouring out of the double doors, a massive shape emerged. It was Silas. He was leading both draft horses out. He had his shirt tied around one horse's eyes and the wet blanket over the other. The horses were bucking, kicking, terrified. Silas held the lead ropes with a grip like iron. His forearms were slick with sweat and black with soot. He dragged the horses out into the yard, handed the ropes to Eleanor, who had run around from the front. "Tie them to the oak tree," Silas barked. "Keep them calm." He turned right back to the fire. He grabbed a shovel from one of the nephews. He joined the line. They fought the fire for an hour. It was brutal, ugly work. Lungs burning, eyes watering, hands blistering all over again. They threw dirt. They threw the last of the barrel water. They beat the flames with wet burlap sacks. Finally, the fire gave up. It died down to a dull, glowing red. The roof of the barn had partially caved in. The side wall was charred black. But the structure stood. The feed was mostly safe. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing of tired people and the crackle of dying embers. Clara stood in the yard. Her hands were on her knees. She was covered in soot. She coughed, a deep, rattling sound. Silas walked over to the side of the barn, the place where the fire had started. He knelt in the dirt. He picked something up. Clara walked over to him. Her legs felt like lead. Silas stood up. He held a crushed, rusted tin can in his hand. It smelled sharply of coal oil. Beside his boot was a piece of torn, oily cloth. A fuse! "This wasn't lightning," Silas said. His voice was completely flat, dead. "I know," Clara said. "A man on horseback," Silas said, pointing to the ground, rode up to the back of the barn, tossed the oil, lit the rag road off. Tracks lead straight back toward town." He looked at the tin can. His knuckles turned white. Josiah Sterling hadn't waited for the bank to take the land. He knew they were digging. He knew they were close to the box. He wanted to burn Clara out before she could fight back. Silas dropped the tin can. He turned around. He started walking toward the house. His pace was fast, determined. Where are you going? Clara asked. Silas didn't stop. He walked right past Murphy. He walked past the pile of dirt. He went to his saddlebags, which were resting on the porch. He unbuckled the heavy leather flap. He reached inside. He pulled out a Winchester repeating rifle. It was a beautiful, deadly piece of machinery, blue steel and polished walnut. He worked the lever action. The metal clacked, a sharp, terrifying sound in the quiet night. He checked the chamber. It was loaded. He started walking toward the gate, where his horse was tied. Silas. Clara's voice cut through the dark. He didn't stop. Stay here, Clara. Keep the men here. If anybody rides up, shoot them. Clara ran. She cut across the yard. She stepped right in front of the gate. She planted her feet. She put her hands on her hips. Silas stopped. He held the rifle at his side. His eyes were cold, the gray, dead eyes of a Pinkerton who was about to go to work. Move, Clara, Silas said. No, Clara said. He tried to burn you alive, Silas said. His voice started to rise. The calm was breaking. The fury was bleeding through. He tried to burn your daughter. He knows we have the papers. The law isn't going to stop a man with that much money. I am going to ride into town. I am going to kick Josiah Sterling's door off its hinges, and I am going to put a bullet in his chest. He stepped forward. Clara didn't budge. She reached out. She placed her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. It was beating like a war drum. Listen to me, Silas Vance, Clara said. She didn't shout, but her voice possessed a weight that commanded him to stay. Silas looked down at her. The rifle twitched in his hand. I am going to state this explicitly, so there is no confusion, Clara said, looking directly into his cold eyes. If you ride into that town tonight and kill Josiah Sterling in the dark, you are nothing but another murderer. I do not care how angry you are. I do not care how justified it feels. We do not build a civilized society by trading one act of violence for another. Silas gritted his teeth. He deserves to die. Maybe he does, Clara stated firmly. But you do not have the right to be the judge, the jury, and the executioner. We reclaim our human rights in the daylight in a courtroom. We do it publicly. We force the world to look at the truth. Our children need to see that justice does not live in the barrel of a gun. If we use murder to solve our problems, we destroy the very foundation of the law. And without the law, we are just animals killing each other in the dirt. Silas stared at her. His chest heaved. The law hung Jacob Miller, Silas whispered harshly. The law is broken, Clara. Then we fix it, Clara said clearly. We do not abandon the rule of law just because corrupt men abuse it. True equality means holding the powerful accountable to the exact same rules that govern the weak. You are carrying guilt because you killed a man wrongfully. Do not add to that weight by killing a man tonight, even if he is guilty. Put the rifle down. We wait for the sun. We take the lockbox to the judge. We do this right. Silas looked at the rifle. Then he looked at the burned barn. Then he looked back at Clara. Her hand was still on his chest, steady, unwavering. The Pinkerton in his eyes slowly faded. The coldness broke. The terrible, heavy weariness returned to his shoulders. He let out a long, ragged breath. He uncocked the hammer of the rifle. You're asking a hard thing, Clara, Silas said quietly. I told you, Clara said. I only know the hard ones. Silas turned around. He walked back to the porch. He leaned the Winchester against the wall. He sat down heavily on the top step. He buried his face in his soot-stained hands. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had stopped him. She had kept him from crossing a line he could never walk back from. The rest of the night passed in a tense, exhausted vigil. Nobody went back to sleep. Murphy and the nephews kept buckets of dirt ready near the barn, watching for any flare-ups. Clara made a pot of black coffee on the cast-iron stove inside. She brought a cup out to Silas. He took it. He didn't say much. The sky began to turn, from pitch black to deep purple, then to a pale, bruised blue. Morning was breaking over Texas. Clara stood on the porch. The heat of the day was already starting to build. She looked out at the dirt road that led to town, the road she used to walk every morning alone. She saw a dust cloud. It was small at first, just a wisp rising above the scrub brush, but it was moving fast. Coming their way. Clara tensed. She set her coffee cup down. "Silas," she said. Silas stood up. His hand drifted toward the rifle, leaning against the wall. He didn't pick it up, but he stood ready. Murphy and the men stepped out from the side of the barn, holding their shovels like weapons. They all watched the road, expecting Sterling's thugs to come back and finish the job in the daylight. A lone rider crested the small hill. It wasn't a young man. It wasn't a hired gun. The horse was a sway-backed roan, sweating. The rider was slumped over the saddle horn, holding the reins with shaking hands. He wore a faded, dirty coat and a battered hat. The rider pulled the horse to a halt right in front of the Harrelson gate. He looked at the burned barn. He looked at the men with shovels. Then he looked at Silas. Silas let go of the rifle. He stepped off the porch. He walked slowly out to the gate. Clara followed him. The rider slid off the horse. His knees buckled slightly when he hit the dirt. He caught himself on the fence rail. It was an old man, gray beard, eyes completely bloodshot, smelling faintly of whiskey and deep fear. Silas stopped at the gate. He looked the old man in pure disbelief. "Amos," Silas said, "I saw the smoke." Amos Miller croaked. His voice was hoarse. He coughed, a dry, rattling sound. "I was camped a few miles out. I saw the smoke against the stars." Clara looked at Silas. "Who is this?" "This is Amos Miller," Silas said. His voice was quiet. Stunned, he was Thomas's friend. He worked the mine with him. Silas had ridden back to the ranch 2 days ago without Amos. Silas had told him the truth, given him the hard speech about duty and conscience. But Amos had been too drunk, too terrified of Sterling. Silas had left him in the cabin, believing the old man was a lost cause, believing cowardice had won. But here he was. Amos looked at Clara. Tears welled up in his rheumy, tired eyes. They cut clean tracks through the dust on his face. "Mrs. Harrelson," Amos whispered. He took his hat off. His hands trembled violently. "I am so sorry. I am so damn sorry. Thomas told me he was going to Austin. He showed me the papers. I told him to burn them. I was scared." Clara stood perfectly still. Her heart pounded. This was the missing piece. There's the voice to match the ink. "You ran," Clara said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact." "I ran," Amos agreed, hanging his head. "I hid like a dog while they buried a good man." Silas reached over the fence. He put a hand on Amos's thin shoulder. "Why are you here, Amos?" Silas asked softly. "I told you to make your choice. You chose to stay in that cabin." Amos looked up. He looked at the burned barn. He looked at Clara standing tall on her own dirt. "I tried to stay," Amos said. His voice broke. "But I heard the widow was fighting back. I heard she dug up the truth. I couldn't sit in the dark anymore while a woman fought my battles. You were right, Vance. A man's conscience don't let him rest." Amos reached into the inside pocket of his dirty coat. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. It had a wax seal from a notary in San Angelo. "I wrote it all down," Amos said, holding the paper out to Clara. 3 years ago. I wrote down exactly what I saw the foreman do to those supports. I had a judge seal it. I kept it hidden, just in case I ever found my courage. He pushed the paper into Clara's hand. "I came on my own," Amos said, his voice finally finding a shred of strength. I'm done running. I will stand in that courtroom. I will look the judge in the eye, and I will tell them exactly what Josiah Sterling did to your husband." Clara looked at the sealed affidavit in her hand. Then she looked at the old, broken man who had finally chosen the light. She turned to Silas, the Pinkerton who had almost traded his soul for a rifle shot in the dark. "Saddle the horses, Mr. Vance," Clara said. "We have a trial to attend." The Oakhaven County Courthouse was an oven. August, Texas didn't care about the law. It didn't care about right or wrong. It just baked the wooden walls and made the air taste like dust. The courtroom was packed. Every bench was full. Folks were standing in the aisles, leaning against the back doors, sweating through their Sunday clothes. They came to see a hanging. They came to see the widow take down the banker. Judge Carroll sat the high desk. He was an old man, bald with a thick gray mustache. He wore a black robe that looked too heavy for the heat. He didn't use a wooden gavel. He used the handle of a heavy hunting knife to pound the desk. "Order," Judge Carroll barked. "The knife handle cracked against the wood. Settle down, or I'll clear this room." The crowd quieted. Clara Harrelson sat at the front bench. Her back was perfectly straight. She wore her best dress. It was simple, faded cotton, but it was clean. Her hands were folded in her lap. She didn't wear her buckskin gloves today. She wanted the judge to see the blisters. She wanted the jury to see the calluses. Eleanor sat next to her, holding her mother-'s arm. Silas Vance stood in the back of the room. He didn't sit. He just leaned against the doorframe, watching the crowd, watching the doors, always the Pinkerton. At the defense table sat Josiah Sterling. He didn't look like a man facing ruin. He looked annoyed. He wore a crisp wool suit. His pocket watch caught the sunlight streaming through the dirty windows. Next to him sat his lawyer, a slick, fast-talking man from San Antonio. A man whose suit cost more than Clara's entire ranch. The trial lasted 3 days. It was an ugly, bruising fight. The San Antonio lawyer was good. He tried to throw out the iron lockbox. He called it circumstantial. He called it stolen property. He questioned the signature on the timber contracts. But Silas took the stand. Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He laid out the paper trail like he was dealing cards. Cold, precise. He showed the county ledger. He showed the red ink where Sterling forged Clara's tax debt. He traced the dummy corporations right back to Sterling S. Bank. The lawyer tried to rattle him. He brought up Silas's past, called him a hired thug. Silas just looked at him with dead gray eyes until the lawyer stopped talking. Then Amos Miller took the stand. The old miner was shaking. He looked small in the witness box. The San Antonio lawyer paced the floor like a hungry dog. He pointed at Amos. He yelled. He called him a drunk, a drifter, a liar looking for a payout. "You expect this court to believe a man who drinks his breakfast?" The lawyer sneered. "You expect us to believe you remember a conversation from 3 years ago?" Amos gripped the wooden rail of the witness stand. His nostrils turned white. He looked out at the crowd. He looked at Clara. Then he looked right at Josiah Sterling. "I remember," Amos said. His voice started as a rasp. Then it grew loud. It echoed off the wooden ceiling. "I remember the foreman telling Thomas the roof was rigged. I remember Thomas saying he was going to Austin. And I remember the foreman saying Mr. Sterling wouldn't like that." The next day, the roof came down. It didn't cave. It fell, like a trapdoor. I remember it. I see it every time I close my eyes. The courtroom went dead silent. Sterling's face finally slipped. The smugness vanished. A hard, cold panic flickered in his eyes. On the afternoon of the third day, Judge Carroll sent the jury out. They didn't stay out long. 2 hours later, they filed back in. The foreman stood up, a local feed store owner. He wouldn't look at Sterling. Judge Carroll adjusted his spectacles. He looked at the piece of paper in his hand. He looked down at the defense table. Josiah Sterling, the judge said. His voice was gravel and iron. Stand up. Sterling stood. He buttoned his jacket. He kept his chin high. The jury has reached a verdict, Judge Carroll read, on the charge of first-degree murder regarding Thomas Harrelson. The evidence is entirely circumstantial. We cannot prove you gave a direct verbal order to cut that beam. On the charge of murder, you are found not guilty. A murmur ran through the crowd. Eleanor gasped. She gripped Clara's arm hard. Clara didn't move. She waited. Judge Carroll raised his hands for silence. However, the judge continued, his voice rising, on the charges of grand fraud, forgery of county tax documents, embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy to commit sabotage resulting in wrongful death, the jury finds you guilty on all counts. Sterling flinched. The lawyer from San Antonio dropped his pen. You used this town as a piggy bank, Josiah, Judge Carroll said, dropping the formal tone. You stole from widows. You put children in deep seams. You are blight on this county. I am ordering your bank seized. I am ordering all your assets liquidated to pay restitution to the families of the miners who died, including the Harrelson family. And when you are completely broke, you will be transported to the state penitentiary in Huntsville for a term of 25 years. May God have mercy on your miserable soul. The handle of the hunting knife cracked against the wood. Court is adjourned. The room erupted. People shouted. The bailiffs grabbed Sterling by the arms. He fought them. He screamed at the judge. He screamed at Clara, but they dragged him away. The wool suit dragged through the dust on the floor. Clara sat on the bench. She didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She felt a strange, an emptiness in her chest. For 3 years, she had carried a rock of anger. Now the rock was gone. She felt light, almost too light. Thomas wasn't coming back, but the truth was out in the daylight. Eleanor pulled on her sleeve. The girl's face was flushed. Her eyes were angry and wet. It's not fair, Eleanor said. Her voice shook. It's not fair, Mama. He killed Daddy. He ordered it. We know he did. He should hang. Prison isn't enough. 25 years isn't enough. He should die for what he did. Clara turned on the wooden bench. She took both of Eleanor's hands in hers. She held them tight. Eleanor, look at me, Clara said. The girl looked up. Clara spoke slowly. She spoke loudly enough for the folks lingering in the rows behind them to hear. She wanted this lesson set in stone. I am going to teach you something right now, Eleanor, and I want you to remember it for the rest of your life, Clara stated explicitly. I understand your anger. I feel it, too. But you must learn the difference between true justice and revenge. They are not the same thing. Revenge is a fire. It burns the wicked, but it burns you down right along with them. It destroys. Claire squeezed the girl's hands. Justice is not about satisfying our bloodlust, Clara continued, her voice clear and rhythmic. Justice is about restoring human dignity. It is about dragging the truth out of the shadows and forcing a corrupt man to stand naked before the law. A cruel, bloody punishment does not make us whole. It just makes us killers, too. We do not demand equality and human rights by acting like the monsters who took them from us. Eleanor sniffled. She looked at the empty defense table. By taking away his power, his money, and his freedom using the law, we proved that we are better than him, Clara said firmly. Reclaiming our dignity and forcing the wicked to bow to the truth that is true healing. We fought for our rights the right way. And that is a victory no man can ever take from you. Do you understand? Eleanor wiped her eyes. She took a deep, shaky breath. I understand, Mama, Eleanor whispered. Good, Clara said. She stood up. She smoothed her faded dress. Come on, let's go home. Out in the courthouse hallway, the air was thick with cigar, smoke, and sweat. Silas Vance stood near the heavy oak doors that led to the street. He was rolling a cigarette. His hands were steady. He had done his job. He had used the paper. He had avoided the gun. He put the cigarette in his mouth, reached for a match. Vance! Silas stopped. He turned around. Amos Miller was standing there. The old miner looked exhausted. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the last 3 days. But his hands weren't shaking anymore. Amos, Silas said. He struck the match, lit his smoke. You did good in there. You told the truth. Amos didn't nod. He didn't smile. He walked closer to Silas. He stopped 2 feet away. He looked up into the tall Pinkerton's face. You didn't recognize me, did you? Amos asked. Silas frowned. I tracked you down in San Angelo. I know who you are. You know my first name, Amos said. His voice was low, grating. You know I worked the Hendricks mine. You know I ran. But you didn't really look at me, did you, Pinkerton? You just saw a tool, a witness to use in court. Silas took the cigarette out of his mouth. A cold prickle of unease crawled up the back of his neck. What are you talking about, Amos? Silas asked. Amos stared into Silas's gray eyes. My last name is Miller, Amos said. I know, Silas said. I grew up in Abilene, Amos continued. The words were heavy, like stones dropping into a deep well. I had a younger brother. We worked a farm together until the crops failed. I went to the mines. He stayed behind, tried to keep the farm alive, tried to feed his wife and kids. Silas stopped breathing. The smoke of his cigarette had curled up between them, stinging his eyes. His name, Amos said, his voice cracking with a sudden violent grief, was Jacob. Jacob Miller. The hallway seemed to tilt. The noise of the crowd faded away into a dull, rushing roar in Silas' ears. Jacob Miller, the innocent man. The man Silas had arrested. The man Silas had watched hang for a bank robbery he didn't commit. The ghost that kept Silas awake every single night. Silas looked at the old man's face. Really looked at it. Beneath the gray beard. Beneath the dirt and the wrinkles. The shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes. It was him. It was Jacob, its brother. Dear God, Silas whispered. He took a step back. The hardened Pinkerton. The man who didn't flinch at drawn guns. He backed away from the broken old miner. The weight of his guilt hit him so hard his knees nearly buckled. I tracked you down, Silas stammered. I brought you here. I didn't know. I knew, Amos said. The minute you kicked open my door in San Angelo, I knew exactly who you were. You were the man who put a rope around my little brother's neck. Silas dropped the cigarette. It smoldered on the floorboards. He didn't make excuses. He didn't defend himself. He knew he was guilty. Amos, Silas said, his voice thick, barely a whisper. I am sorry. I was wrong. I was so arrogant. I didn't look deep enough. I took a good man's life. You did, Amos agreed bluntly. He didn't offer a polite contradiction. He offered the harsh, brutal truth. If you want to draw a gun right now, Silas said, holding his hands open by his sides, if you want to end it, I won't stop you. Amos looked at Silas's empty hands. He looked at the holster on Silas's hip. The old man shook his head slowly. I'm going to say this to you, Vance, Amos stated explicitly, his voice steadying. And I want you to carry it for the rest of your days. I do not forgive you. I will never forgive you. You broke my family. You took a father away from his children. That is a sin that blood and time cannot wash away. Silas closed his eyes. The words felt like a knife slipping between his ribs. But, Amos continued, Silas opened his eyes. Amos stood up a little straighter. The cowardice was completely gone from him. He looked like a man who had finally settled his accounts with the universe. But today, in that courtroom, Amos said, I watched you stand up for a widow. I watched you use your skills to drag a monster into the light. I watched you help a family find peace instead of putting them in the ground. You used your life today to save somebody else. Amos reached out. He placed a rough, calloused hand on Silas's arm. A man's life ain't measured by a single act, Amos said clearly. It's measured by the whole sum of his days. I don't forgive you for my brother, but I acknowledge the good you did today. You can't fix the past, Pinkerton. But you can damn well spend the rest of your life trying to balance the scales. Do you hear me? Silas swallowed the hard lump in his throat. He looked at the hand on his arm, a gesture of human grace from a man who had every right to kill him. I hear you, Amos, Silas choked out. Amos nodded once. He let go of Silas's arm. He turned around. He walked down the crowded hallway, pushing through the swinging oak doors, out into the blinding hot Texas sunlight. Silas stood alone in the shadow of the courthouse. He leaned his back against the wall. He dragged his hand down his face. He wasn't forgiven. He wasn't absolved. But for the first time in 3 long, dark years, Silas Vance felt like he might actually be able to breathe. The earth finally gave way. It was late Tuesday afternoon. The sun was beating down like a hammer on an anvil. Murphy was 10 feet down in the pit, covered head to toe in red mud. He swung the heavy iron pickaxe one last time. It didn't thud, it splashed. A sharp, sudden cracking sound echoed up from the hole, like a dry bone snapping. Then came a rushing noise, a deep, hollow gurgle. Rope! Murphy bellowed. His voice bounced off the dirt walls. Haul me up! She's coming fast! The men on the surface grabbed the thick hemp rope. They hauled with everything they had, hand over hand. Murphy scrambled up the side of the pit, his boots slipping in the sudden mud. They dragged him over the edge just as the bottom of the hole collapsed inward. Clara ran to the edge. Eleanor was right beside her. They looked down. The dark, dry earth was bubbling. A surge of thick, muddy water pushed up from the bedrock. It rose fast, swallowing the bottom of the shaft, covering the loose rocks, climbing the walls. It was the aquifer. The deep earth had finally opened up. Drop a bucket, Hetty Walsh yelled, clapping her hands together. One of the nephews tied a wooden bucket to a rope. He tossed it down. It hit the rising water with a heavy splash. He let it sink, then hauled it back up. He swung the bucket over the dirt mound and set it on the grass. The water was brown, thick with silt and clay, but it was water. Clara dropped to her knees. She didn't care about the mud. She cupped her hands. She dipped them into the bucket. She brought the water to her face. She washed the dirt from her cheeks. Then she dipped her hands again and took a drink. It tasted like iron. It tasted like earth. It tasted like freedom. Give it a few hours to settle, Murphy said, wiping his muddy face with a rag. He was grinning from ear to ear. By tomorrow morning, that water will be clear as glass. You got a deep well, Clara. It won't ever run dry. Eleanor laughed, a bright, ringing sound that Clara hadn't heard in 3 years. The girl knelt in the mud and hugged her mother tight. Clara held her daughter. She looked over Eleanor's shoulder. Silas was standing near the porch. He was watching them. He didn't smile, but the hard lines around his mouth were softer. He tipped his hat to her just once, a quiet acknowledgement of a battle won. Clara had her water. She didn't have to walk the dark road anymore. That evening, the ranch was quiet. The men had packed up their shovels and gone back to town. Hetty had left a fresh-baked pie on the kitchen table. The air was finally cooling down. Silas sat in the lean-to behind the barn. His saddlebags were open on his cot. He was packing his spare shirts. He was checking the action on his Winchester. He had done what he came to do. He had stood guard. He had found the paper trail. He had watched Josiah Sterling get dragged away in chains. Clara didn't need a Pinkerton anymore. She didn't need a silent sentinel. A shadow fell across the open doorway. It was Sheriff Miller. He stood there, holding a small white envelope. "Evening, Vance," the sheriff said. "Sheriff," Silas replied. He kept wiping down his rifle. "Amos Miller came to my office before he rode out of town," the sheriff said. "He asked me to give this to you, said he had it forwarded from Abilene." Silas stopped. He looked at the envelope. He set the rifle down. He walked over and took the letter. "Have a good night, Vance," the sheriff said. He turned and walked away. Silas stood in the dim light of the lean-to. He looked at the handwriting on the envelope. It was neat, careful. A woman's handwriting. He broke the wax seal. He pulled out the single sheet of paper. He sat down on his cot. He unfolded the letter. His hands, which had never shaken when holding a gun, trembled slightly. He read the words, "Dear Mr. Vance, Amos wrote to me. He told me about the trial in Oakhaven. He told me what you did for the widow Harrelson and how you fought to save her family. He also told me that you finally know who he is, who my husband was." Silas squeezed his eyes shut for a second. He took a ragged breath. He kept reading. "I am writing this letter to state my mind plainly. I want you to read these words and understand exactly what they mean. I do not offer you blind forgiveness. You took Jacob from me. You took a father from my children. The pain of that mistake will live with my family forever. You have no right to forget your sins. You must carry that weight." The paper crinkled in Silas's grip. The truth was a heavy, bitter thing. "But," the letter continued, "Amos says you are a man drowning in your own guilt. He says you think your life is over. I am a mother, Mr. Vance, and I am going to educate you right now on the reality of human nature. I am stating this explicitly. Every human being has a fundamental right to start over. You have the right to use your bloodied hands to build something good. If you spend the rest of your life punishing yourself in the dark, then my husband died for absolutely nothing. You owe it to Jacob to be a better man. You must choose to heal. Children need to see that a man can fix what he broke. They need to see that a person is not defined entirely by their worst mistake. They need an example of true redemption. You used the law to hurt us. Now, use your life to protect others. Do not waste the second chance that my brother-in-law gave you in that hallway. Stand up, walk in the light, and do some good. Sincerely, Martha Miller." Silas finished the letter. He stared at the signature. Martha Miller, the widow he had created. The hardened Pinkerton detective. The man who had faced down outlaws. The man who had arrested killers without blinking. Silas Vance bent over. He rested his elbows on his knees. He buried in his scarred hands, and he wept. It wasn't a quiet cry. It was a deep, chest-heaving sob. It was the sound of 3 years of ice finally cracking. 3 years of self-hatred pouring out onto the dirt floor of a lean-to. Martha Miller hadn't forgiven the act, but she had restored his humanity. She had explicitly given him the permission he could never give himself. The permission to try again. The right to live. He cried until his chest ached. He cried until there was nothing left. When he finally looked up, the moon was high. The night was quiet. Silas folded the letter. He put it in his breast pocket, right over his heart. He looked at his saddlebags. He started unpacking them. 4 in the morning, Texas. The air was still. The crickets were chirping. Clara woke up. She opened her eyes. She lay in bed for a moment, listening to the quiet house. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed. She didn't put on her boots. She slipped into her shoes. She wrapped a light shawl over her shoulders. She walked out the back door. She stood by the new well. The mud had dried. The bucket was sitting on the stone ledge. She looked down. The water reflected the starlight, clear and calm. She didn't need to haul water. The work was done. But Clara turned around. She walked around the house. She went out the front gate. She stepped onto the dirt road. She didn't have her buckets. Her hands were empty. She walked the half-mile. Left, right. Left, right. The road felt different without the heavy wood biting into her palms. It felt shorter. It felt peaceful. She rounded the bend. The old public well came into view. Silas was there. He wasn't standing like a sentry anymore. He was sitting on the edge of the stone wall. His hat was pushed back. He was watching the horizon, waiting for the sun. He heard her footsteps. He stood up. He looked at her empty hands. "You got water at home, Clara," Silas said. His voice was softer than it had ever been. "You don't need to be out here." Clara walked right up to him. She didn't stop 5 yards away. She stopped 2 feet away. "I know," Clara said. "Then why did you walk the road?" Silas asked. Clara looked up at him. She saw the change in his face. The dead gray in his eyes was gone. They were tired, yes, but they were alive. "Because I need to make something very clear to you, Silas Vance," Clara said. Her voice was steady, rhythmic. "I want to state this plainly, so there is no guessing between us." Silas was still listening. "Folks in this world think love is about needing someone," Clara said explicitly. "They think a woman needs a man to carry her water, to fight her battles, to put a roof over her head. They think love is a transaction, a trait of weakness for protection." She reached out. She took one of his large, scarred hands in hers. "I am educating you right now on what true partnership is," Clara continued. "True partnership, true love between equals is not about leaning on someone because you can't stand up. It is choosing to stand side by side when both of your buckets are already full. It is walking the road together because you want the company, not because you are afraid of the dark." Silas looked down at their joined hands. His thumb brushed over her calluses. "I don't need you to save me, Silas," Clara said. "I proved I can save myself. I proved I can dig my own well. But I walked out here today because I want to look you in the eye and tell you this. I want you to walk beside me, not in front of me, not behind me, beside me, because an equal partnership is the only kind of love worth having." Silas looked into her eyes. He felt the letter in his breast pocket, the permission to live, the permission to build something good. He squeezed her hand. "I have a lot of broken pieces, Clara," Silas said quietly. "I have a past that I can't erase." "I know," Clara said, "and I have scars that will never fully fade. But I'll tell you another truth, explicitly and plainly. A person's worth is not defined by the unbroken pieces they have left. It's defined by how they put themselves back together. You are a good man, Silas. You proved it when it counted. You proved it in the daylight." Silas let out a long, slow breath. The last bit of tension left his shoulders. He didn't pull her into a sudden, desperate embrace. That wasn't who they were. They were older. They were weathered. They knew the value of taking things slow. Instead, he stepped closer. He brought his other hand up. He gently rested it on her waist. "I would be honored to walk beside you, Clara Harrelson," Silas said, "for as many miles as you'll have me." Clara smiled. It reached all the way to her eyes. "Then let's watch the sun come up," Clara said. They turned. They stood shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand, leaning slightly against the stone wall of the old well. The horizon began to crack. The deep purple of the Texas sky split open, bleeding brilliant streaks of orange, gold, and crimson. The light hit the dusty plains. It warmed the cool morning air. Clara took a deep breath. She had walked this road in the dark for 3 years, alone, carrying a terrible weight. Today, her hands were empty of burdens. Today, she held the hand of a man who respected her strength. A man who understood the hard value of truth and equal ground. The sun crested the horizon, blinding and beautiful. They stood there together. Two people who had walked through the fire, who had dug through the hard earth, and finally found the water they needed to survive, and neither of them was thirsty anymore. Autumn came late to Texas, but it came. The brutal heat finally broke in late October. The wind shifted. It blew down from the north. It smelled like pine needles and cold dirt. The leaves on the great oak tree in Clara's front yard turned a deep, burnt orange. The ranch was breathing again. The new well pumped clear, cold water. The troughs were full. The horses put on weight. The bank in town had a new manager, a quiet man from Dallas who followed the law. Josiah Sterling was gone, locked in a stone cell in Huntsville, and Hendricks Mining had paid. The restitution check arrived in a thick manila envelope. It was enough to pay off every debt, enough to buy new seed, enough to fix the barn, and enough to send Eleanor away. It was a Tuesday morning. The air was sharp. Clara stood on the porch. She held a cup of black coffee. She watched the stagecoach pull up to the front gate. Eleanor stood beside her. She wore a new wool coat. She carried a leather traveling bag. She was going to Austin, to the normal school, to learn how to be a teacher. The driver loaded her trunk. He tipped his hat. Eleanor turned to her mother. The girl looked older now. The anger from the summer was gone. Her eyes were bright, clear. "I'm going to miss you, Mama," Eleanor said. Clara put her coffee cup down on the railing. She reached out. She pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. She smelled the lavender soap in Eleanor's hair. "I'll miss you every day, Elle," Clara said. Eleanor pulled back just a little. She looked at the ranch. She looked at the new well. Then she looked at her mother. "I used to lie awake, Mama," Eleanor whispered, "back when you walked to the public well. I used to hear the door click shut at 4 in the morning. I was so scared. I didn't understand why you had to go out there in the pitch black, why you wouldn't just ask for help." Clara nodded slowly. She smoothed the collar of Eleanor's coat. "I know you were scared," Clara said. "I thought you were just stubborn," Eleanor admitted. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "But I understand now. You went out there because you had to prove you wouldn't break." Clara looked deep into her daughter's eyes. This was the moment. The final lesson before the girl stepped out into the world. "Listen to me, Eleanor," Clara said. Her voice was firm, steady, rhythmic. "I am going to state this explicitly, and I want you to carry it with you to Austin. I went out into that dark because I refused to let fear dictate the terms of my life. A woman's strength does not come from pretending the dark isn't scary. It comes from walking into it anyway." Eleanor listened. She didn't blink. "But I want to educate you on another truth," Clara continued, her words clear and deliberate. "Choosing to be alone when you are surrounded by corrupt men is a matter of survival. But choosing to let someone good walk beside you, after you have already proven you can stand on your own 2 feet, that is true courage. Independence does not mean isolation. You have the right to be strong, and you have the right to be loved. Do not ever let the world tell you that you must choose between your dignity and your heart." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She didn't let them fall. "I won't, Mama," Eleanor said. "I promise." "Go on now." Clara said. Learn everything they have to teach you, and then come back and teach it better. Eleanor hugged her one last time. She climbed into the stagecoach. The driver cracked the whip. The horses stepped out. The coach rolled down the dirt road, kicking up a small cloud of autumn dust. Clara stood on the porch. She watched till the coach disappeared around the bend. The yard was quiet. A floorboard creaked behind her. Silas stepped out of the house. He wore a clean flannel shirt. His hair was brushed. The gray in his beard looked silver in the morning sun. He held 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Clara. She'll do fine, they said. She will, Clara agreed. She took a sip. The coffee was hot, bitter, perfect. Silas looked out at the road. He looked at the oak tree. He looked at the barn he had helped save. He had stayed through the harvest. He had fixed fences. He had chopped wood. He slept in the lean-to. He never pushed. He never assumed. He just worked. Winter is coming, Silas said. It is, Clara said. I patched the roof on the lean-to, Silas said. He ran a thumb along the rim of his tin cup. Should hold against the frost. But a man gets tired of sleeping outside. Clara turned her head. She looked at him. Are you asking me for a raise, Mr. Vance? Clara asked. A slight, knowing smile played on her lips. Or are you giving me your notice? Silas turned. He looked at her, really looked at her. He didn't get down on one knee. He didn't take his hat off and fumble with the brim. He stood tall. He met her gaze. I am doing neither, Clara, Silas said. His voice was a low, steady rumble. I am educating you on my intentions, plainly and explicitly. I am 47 years old. I have a past that is written in blood and regret. I have nothing to offer you but a pair of scarred hands and a promise to always tell you the truth. Clara didn't interrupt. She held her coffee cup. She listened. I am stating this clearly, Silas continued. I do not want to own you. I do not want to manage your land. I do not want to fix your problems. You are the strongest person I have ever met. You dug your own well. You saved your own ranch. You don't need a savior. You don't need a guard. He set his coffee cup on the rail. He stepped closer. But I am asking for something, Silas said. I won't stand in front to shield you. I won't stand behind to push you. I'm asking for a place to walk alongside you as an equal. True to equality in a marriage means 2 complete people choosing to share the road. Nothing more. Nothing less. I am asking you to marry me, Clara. Clara looked at him. The wind rustled the dry leaves of the oak tree. A hawk circled high above the fields. She thought about the dark road. She thought about the heavy wooden buckets. She thought about the silence. Then she thought about the man standing in front of her. The man who had left gloves on a rock. The man who had handed her the paperwork to hang her enemy. The man who had listened to a grieving widow's letter and chosen to heal instead of hide. Clara put her cup down next to his. My well has water, Silas, Clara said softly. I know, Silas said. I don't need a man to carry my buckets, she said. I know, Silas repeated. Clara reached out. She took his hand. Her calluses scraped against his scars. It was a perfect fit, rough, real. But the road is long, Clara said, and the quiet is better when it's shared. I will marry you, Silas Vance, because I choose to, not because I have to. Silas didn't smile wide. He just let out a long, shuddering breath, like a man who had been walking a tightrope for months and finally felt solid ground under his boots. He pulled her close. He kissed her. It wasn't a desperate kiss. It wasn't wild. It was deep. It was grounded. It was the kiss of 2 survivors who had finally found home. The wedding was small. They didn't go to the church in town. Clara didn't want the spectacle. They held it right in the front yard, under the branches of the great oak tree. It was a brisk Saturday in November. Reverend Hale came out from Oakhaven. He was a practical man. He didn't preach a long sermon, he just read the vows. Hetty Walsh was there. She wore her best feathered hat. She cried into a lace handkerchief. Murphy the blacksmith stood next to her. He wore a suit that was 2 sizes too small in the shoulders. He looked uncomfortable but proud, and standing right behind Silas, serving as his witness, was Amos Miller. The old miner had stayed in Oakhaven. He took a job sweeping up at the Mercantile. He was sober. His hands didn't shake anymore. Before the ceremony, Amos had walked up to Silas. "My brother," Amos had said quietly, "wouldn't want me to carry hate to my grave. He was a better man than me. Lighter heart. I stand here today for you, to watch you keep your promise, to watch you build something good." Silas had nodded. He had shaken the old man, and the ceremony was quick. Clara wore a dark blue dress. Silas wore a dark suit. They said the words. They exchanged plain gold bands. "I pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Hale said. Murphy cheered. Hetty dabbed her eyes. There was no grand reception, just a good meal. Hetty had roasted a ham. Murphy brought a jug of cider. They sat around the long wooden table in Clara's kitchen. They ate, they talked, they laughed. It was simple. It was honest. It was exactly right. By nightfall, the guests were gone. The house was quiet. The wind howled around the eaves, but the kitchen was warm. The fire in the cast stove burned bright. Silas sat at the table. He was looking at the gold band on his left hand. Clara walked up behind him. She rested her hands on his broad shoulders. He reached up and covered her hands with his. "We did it," Silas said. "We did," Clara said. They didn't need to say much else. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable. It was a space they had built together. The next morning, 4 o'clock. The house was pitch black. The air inside was freezing. The fire in the stove had burned down to white ash. Clara woke up. Her eyes snapped open. It was a habit ingrained in her bones. 3 years of waking up in the dark. 3 years of preparing for the hard walk. Her body didn't know that the well was in the backyard. Her body didn't know she was married. She lay there for a moment. She listened to the deep, steady breathing of the man sleeping beside her. Silas lay on his back, one arm thrown over his head, the other resting across Clara's waist. He was dead to the world. A man who finally slept without ghosts. Clara carefully slipped out from under his arm. She didn't put on her boots. She slid her feet into her soft leather shoes. She pulled a thick woolen shawl around her shoulders. She walked softly through the house. She opened the front door. The Texas cold hit her face. It was sharp, clean. The stars were brilliant, millions of them scattered across the black sky like spilled salt. Clara stepped off the porch. She walked out the front gate. She stepped onto the dirt road. She looked down at her hands. They were empty. She didn't have the wooden buckets. She didn't have the iron hoops. She didn't have the rope handles cutting into her palms. She took a breath. Then she heard the heavy thud of boots on the porch. She turned around. Silas was standing there. He had pulled his trousers on. He wore his flannel shirt unbuttoned. He held his boots in one hand. He hadn't bothered to put them on yet. He walked down the steps in his stocking feet. He walked out the gate. He stopped right beside her. He dropped his boots in the dirt. He didn't ask her what she was doing. He didn't ask her why she was awake. He knew. He reached out. He took her empty hand in his. "Cold out here," Silas said. "It is," Clara said. "You walking?" Silas asked. "Just a little ways," Clara said. They started walking down the dirt road, toward the crossroads, toward the old public well. They walked slow. The rhythm was natural. Left, right, left, right. But it wasn't the frantic, determined march of survival anymore. It was a stroll. Clara looked at the dark horizon. She had walked this exact road hundreds of times. In the freezing cold, in the blistering heat, in the rain, she had walked it with a heart full of grief. She had walked it with a mind full of fear. She had walked it because she believed that if she stopped, she would die. But as the first pale light of dawn began to crack through the eastern sky, Clara realized something profound. The road hadn't changed. The dirt, scrub brush was still thorny. The world was still a hard, unforgiving place. But she had changed. She didn't need the dark anymore to hide her fear. She didn't need the heavy buckets to prove her worth. She looked at the tall, broad-shouldered man walking beside her. His grip on her hand was firm, warm, steady. He wasn't leading her. He wasn't dragging her. He was just matching her stride. Step for step, the sun broke over the edge of the world. It flooded the plains with golden light. It hit the dust in the air, making it sparkle. It warmed Clara's face. So they reached the old stone well. They didn't stop. They didn't even look at the iron crank. They just kept walking right past it, walking together into the light of a brand new day. Clara Harrelson Vance smiled. She had walked to the well before sunrise every day in resilient solitude, not because she loved the dark, but because she had to. Now she walks in the light, not because she needs a man to lead the way, but because she finally found an equal to share the journey. This channel shares powerful Western stories about cowboys, frontier, love, motherhood, kindness between strangers, mercy, compassion, and the human spirit that survives against all odds. The lesson is simple. When one person stands up, others may finally find the courage to stand beside them. Some characters in this story may display flawed judgment, emotional instability, or morally questionable choices as part of their personal journeys. These portrayals are intended to explore human emotion and conflict within a fictional context and should not be interpreted as guidance or endorsement.
Clara Harrelson's story leaves us with a truth as deep as any well dug into Texas soil. Dignity is not something the world hands to us gently. Sometimes dignity must be carried through darkness, defended through pain, and protected even when pride and loneliness become heavy burdens. Clara began this journey as a widow, walking alone before sunrise, determined to pull her own water and prove that she was not broken. But by the end, she learned something even greater. Strength does not always mean standing alone. True strength is knowing the difference between pity and respect, between help that weakens you and help that honors your right to fight your own battle. This story teaches us that justice is not the same as revenge. Revenge is quick, hot, and tempting, especially when someone has taken what we love. But revenge can turn even a wounded heart into something cruel. Justice, on the other hand, brings truth into the daylight. It forces lies to answer for themselves. It restores dignity not only to the living, but also to those who can no longer speak. Clara could have let anger guide her. Silas could have used his gun instead of his conscience. But together, they chose the harder path. They chose law over blood, truth over violence, and courage over hatred. There is also a powerful lesson about community. For too long, the town stayed silent because silence felt safe. But silence in the face of injustice is never neutral. It protects the powerful and abandons the weak. When Clara stood her ground, she awakened the courage in others. Her neighbors finally understood that compassion is not just feeling sorry for someone. Compassion means showing up, sharing the danger, and helping carry the weight without stealing someone's dignity. And perhaps the most moving lesson is this: no person is only their worst mistake. Silas carried guilt from his past, and Amos carried shame from his cowardice. Yet both men were given a chance to step into the light and do what was right. Redemption did not come through words alone. It came through action, sacrifice, honesty, and the willingness to face the truth. In the end, this is more than a Western tale about land, water, and justice. It is a story about human worth.
It reminds us that a woman's strength does not need permission, that love must be built on respect, and that truth may be buried for a time, but it does not stay buried forever. Like Clara's hidden lockbox beneath the dry earth, the truth waits for brave hands to uncover it. And when it finally rises, even the most powerful men must answer for what they have done.